Hi everyone, welcome back. I missed you all last week. I hope you had a good 2 weeks. So today we're coming back with a bang because we have a cult. Now I haven't actually done that many cults on this channel. I've only done one other cult, which was the Anthill Kids cult, which was, how do you even describe that cult? The Anthill Kids cult is definitely a very heavy one, but unfortunately today's isn't that much better. And the cult that we're going to be covering today is from the UK, and being from the UK myself, I was really shocked at this because you don't hear about British cults that often. I mean, the UK has its fair share of some of the most sadistic people on the planet, but you don't really hear that much about British cults. So when I heard about this cult, I was shocked.
3 women who claim they've been held as slaves in a home in London for at least 30 years.
A 69-year-old from Malaysia, a 57-year-old from Ireland, and a 30-year-old British woman. We have seen some cases where people have been held for up to 10 years, but we have never seen anything of this magnitude before. Thank you.
And I literally only found out about this cult a couple of weeks ago, and I was blown away, and I was like, right, that's it. I've got to do this cult straight away. Now, this cult it does have an official name, but it does have a couple of names. This is the Workers' Institute cult, and they operated for over 30 years in the middle of London. Just smack bang in the middle of London, in a regular house on a busy street in London, there was a cult for over 30 years. This cult was literally hiding in plain sight, which is very unusual, isn't it? Because when you think of cults, you think of a community of people running off into the mountains, into the wilderness, jungle, something like that. But this cult was just living in plain sight. And this cult was led by a man called Aravindan Balakrishnan. And he is just a typical cult leader. He's very egotistical, he's very narcissistic, he has a god complex, and there are some absolutely horrific things that we're going to talk about in this video, so I do have to give a warning. We're going to be talking about extreme abuse, extreme manipulation, extreme brainwashing, sexual abuse. Some of this as well happens to a baby, literally a child, because that is one of the most shocking things about this case, is that a baby was born into this cult and was held captive for 30 years. 30 years. How is this possible in the middle of London? And this baby was Katy Morgan-Davies, and it's really just crazy. We are going to be focusing a lot on her story throughout this case, but yeah, I just can't even imagine she was held for 30 years. 30 years. Let that sink in. So we have a lot to get through, and I mean that, and it is kind of a complicated story as well. I did have a lot of difficulties when I was doing my research because it is so complicated and there's just so many characters and there's so many things that happened in this cult. I mean, this cult went on for like nearly 40 years, so there is a lot of information in this video. I am going to try and make it as simple as possible, but grab a 3-course meal. We are going to be here for a while. And let's just dive straight in. Aravindan Balakrishnan was born on the 16th of July, 1940, making him our official first cancer. And Aravindan does go by the names Bala and also AB, but just for the sake of this video and to make it less confusing, I'm just going to be calling him Bala. And Bala was born in Kerala, India. And because of his dad's work, he did move to Singapore when he was 10 years old. Now, Bala was extremely intelligent, which is something that he would definitely use to his advantage later on. And he was also a pretty short child, and even as an adult, he only ever grew to the height of 5'3". Now, Bala would get repeatedly told by his mother that he possessed supernatural powers and that he was also possessed by the occult. Now, I read that she thought that he was possessed because he used to swear quite a lot and he used to curse other people when he was angry, which I don't exactly think that that means you are possessed by the occult, but that is what his mom would think. It was enough to make Bala truly believe that he was possessed and had supernatural powers. And this is definitely something that he would tell everyone later on in life. I feel like already, even as a child, you can see the potential cult leader in him. And apart from that, not much is actually known about Bala's childhood, which is really annoying because I do like to look into the childhood of the people that we cover on this channel because I do think it plays a part, and Bala is definitely someone that I would have liked to have known more about his childhood. Now we are jumping to Bala when he's aged 23 and he arrives in the UK for the first time, and obviously this is where the rest of the case takes place. And I do just think it's really shocking that this cult happened in the middle of London. Like, how did no one know about this? It was literally happening under people's noses. And once Balor arrives in the UK, he really does start to become the cult leader that he clearly has always wanted to be. So Balor had arrived to the UK on a scholarship to study at one of the London universities. He threw himself into the school politics of his university. Balor believed that the UK was turning into what he said, quote, a fascist state. And Balor's solution to this was radical communism. And in particular, he closely followed the teachings of China's chairman Mao. And to be honest, what Balor believed in was actually really confusing, and to be honest, I don't think Balor himself even knew exactly what he believed in, but basically, just to make it really simple, Balor was basically anti-establishment, anti-authority. He hated being told what to do. He thought that the UK government was overbearing, too controlling, and a revolution was needed to put a stop to this. So throughout the 60s in the UK, Balor was handing out leaflets. He was kind of preaching on the streets to people to believe in the things that he believed in. And he was involved in a lot of protests, which involved a lot of clashes with the police. He also joined quite a few political organizations, but his views were so extreme that those organizations, which were already extreme in themselves, kicked Balor out. And I feel like you see this a lot with cult leaders where they originally join organizations or religions or anything like that. They try and overthrow that organization, fail, and then get kicked out, because that's basically what happened with Balor. So because Balor was kicked out of these organizations, Balor basically took on the mentality of, you know what, screw you, I'm going to start my own organization. And this is where the cult is born. He set up his own organization called the Workers' Institute. And I really am fascinated by cults. I've looked into quite a lot of cults in depth, and I feel like this is just the beginning of every cult. I feel like there is just a handbook that they all follow. So Balor had about 25 loyal followers that joined him in his new organization, and him and his little group of followers would go onto the street, hand out leaflets, try and talk to as many people as possible, try and recruit as many people as possible into their organization, or should I say cult. Then to make things even more culty, is that even a word? Culty, whatever, I'm going with it. To make things even more culty, they set up a headquarters in just an old building in the middle of Brixton, London, and all of Balor's followers lived in this headquarters. So yeah, it's just a cult, it's just a commune. And all of these followers, which was like 25 people, would sleep in this headquarters on the floor. Now, Balor at this time wasn't the most strict. He definitely gets worse, but Balor at this time only had one rule, and that is that all men must sleep in one room, all women in the other room, and nobody was allowed to have sex with one another apart from Balor. Balor was allowed to have sex with anyone he wanted. It's like, could you get any more stereotypical cult leader? It's like, literally, why is that always a thing? Why is it that the cult leader always wants to have sex with absolutely everyone but bans sex for anyone else? Now, this group, I should really just call them a cult, shouldn't I, were a nightmare for the neighbours, because obviously they're just in this random house in London, so they do have neighbours. And this group were very hostile, rude, argumentative to the neighbours. They were causing so much trouble. They were basically just really rude and dismissive to anybody that didn't hold the same beliefs as them. So there was this one incident where clearly a neighbour was having a party, I don't know, a little get together, and they were creating a little bit too much noise. And Balor did not like this. So Balor got a meat cleaver. We're going there. He got a meat cleaver, stormed into his neighbour's house. A man was just standing on the stairs, kind of leaning on the banister. And Balor got the meat cleaver and swung it to hit the man's arm that was on the banister. Thankfully, that man moved his arm in time and the meat cleaver was just stuck in the banister. But it's just like, what the hell? Balor has literally gone to hack off someone's arm because they're making too much noise. It's like, imagine just being in your house, there's a little like barbecue party or something, and a neighbour, a strange, crazed, possessed man comes into your home with a meat cleaver to hack off your arm. I'm sorry, but that is terrifying. And Balor was reported to the police and he was sent to prison, but he was only sent to prison for 2 months. 2 months. I'm sorry, but the UK needs to get its act together with these prison sentences. And after Balor was released, after these 2 months, he was even more riled up. He hated the British state even more. He was spreading even more lies, more propaganda. He was saying that the British state were framing him. There was another time that he did also get arrested. Again, though, his prison sentence was only a few months. It's like, seriously? And when he was in the court, when he was being sentenced, he wasn't paying attention to anything that was going on. Instead, he was just chanting the words, quote, "Death to the British fascist state, victory to world revolution." And then after Balor got out of prison that second time, he decided that he wasn't going to risk it anymore. He couldn't be out in public, out in the open, doing what he was doing. He needed to go underground. And this is where it really does get very cult-like now. Like, this is full-blown, we are in the cult now. So we're moving into the 80s now, and the group are moving into a house that was given to them by the local council. Balor told everyone that they needed to drop off the radar in order to protect themselves from the British state. Balor told all of his followers that they would need to cut off all ties with family, friends. They would need to leave the house as little as possible. And after hearing this, a lot of his followers were just like, yeah, nah, this is not for me. I'm out. But Balor was left with a few loyal followers, which were all women, I should add. And there were 8 women who were all prepared to move in with Balor into this house in Brixton and basically follow him and do whatever he wanted. Now is probably a good time to kind of list off the followers that were in the group. So we obviously have 8 women. One of the women was a woman named Chanda, and she was Balor's wife. I know, Balor has a wife who is now a dedicated, loyal follower. Then there was Chanda's sister, who was also in the cult. I don't actually think she was there by choice. I think she was made to be there. And then there were 6 other followers who were Sean, Josie, Aisha, Leanne, Cindy, and O. And Sean is probably the most significant out of those followers. Now, Sean first met Balor when she was at university. She was in her early 20s. She was an extremely gifted person, but she had kind of become a little bit lost, a little bit disillusioned with life. And she was just really craving someone to guide her through life, take her under their wing. And this is when she met Balor at university, and she got taken up with him. She started to believe his message, his beliefs. She completely cut off ties with all of her friends, all of her family, and became probably Balor's most devoted follower. Now, as well as Sean, the 6 other women had a very similar profile. They all met Balor when they were in their early 20s, when they were at university. All of them were just a little bit lost, didn't really know where their life was going, craving just someone to give them a little bit of direction, and they met Balor. Balor could see that they were a little bit lost, took advantage of them, and then they became a follower in his cult. But what is absolutely crazy is that one of the women in the cult actually gave up an engagement to be in the cult, which I think is just absolutely crazy. Like, how does Balor have that much influence? So these women just literally packed up their lives, said goodbye to their old lives, and moved into this house in Brixton. Balor told the women all the time that everyone outside of the house was an enemy and a member of the evil British state. And basically the group, which is now known as the Collective, needed to hide themselves from the British state so they could start a revolution. Pretty much with all cults, what you find is in the beginning, the people in the cult are really devoted, really believe in the message and everything that the leader is saying. And this is exactly the case with the women in the cult. They were full of hope, full of optimism. They were literally hanging on every word that Balor said. Balor created this us against the world mentality. He gave his followers purpose. He gave them an identity. As with all cults though, this us against the world message soon turns into me against you. You must do as I say. I am the greatest. Balor started to tell the collective more extreme stories about how powerful he was, how he was the greatest, the almighty. And Balor was just slowly brainwashing his collective. He was slowly manipulating them into believing that he had these supernatural powers, that he was this almighty being. He did it in a way that was so slow that the women in the cult probably didn't even realize that it was happening. Balor then started to tell his collective that he was God. Yeah, let's not beat around the bush here. He was telling his followers that he was God, literally God. And like I've said, could he be any more stereotypical cult leader? Balor also told the collective that he was the ruler of the world. And I'm being deadly serious here. He said that he was the ruler of the world. Conveniently for Balor, he was the secret ruler of the world. He said that because the British state was out to get him, he had to rule the world in secret. So this explained why no one else in the world knew that he was the ruler of the world. That's just very convenient, isn't it? I literally feel like I'm just listing off the most ridiculous things in the world ever. But here's another one for you. Balor also told his followers that he had mind control. Yeah, he possessed the power to control your mind. He could literally create earthquakes, thunderstorms with just a click of his finger. He also said that every war ever in the history of the world, so every single war, he was responsible for. And I feel like this is a very good time to point out that Balor was also claiming to be immortal. He also claimed responsibility for the splitting of the atom and the moon landing. Basically, any significant advancement or event ever in the history of ever, forever and ever, Balor was responsible for. I told you he was egotistical, and I definitely think that Balor has to be the most egotistical person I think I've ever come across. But Balor didn't do this completely on his own. Clearly, even he thought that it was a little bit too far-fetched to believe that one person could be responsible for all of this. So Balor had a sidekick who he called Jackie. And you're probably thinking, who's Jackie? Who are they? Well, they're not even a real person. They are a made-up figment of Balor's imagination. It was just a made-up character for Balor to use to manipulate his followers. So Jackie is not even a person, it's actually an acronym. So Jackie stands for Jehovah, Allah, Christ, Krishna, Immortal, Iswaran. And Jackie was this all-powerful machine, this invisible computer that only Balor could control. Again, very convenient that Jackie is invisible and only Balor can control it. And Jackie could do pretty much anything, whether it was the mundane things of just turning on the kettle, turning on a light switch, to the more extreme things like literally causing a person to just drop dead, or even destroying a whole country with just a click of Balor's fingers. So basically, Jackie can do everything and anything. Whatever Balor wants, Jackie will do. And these were the kinds of things that Balor would tell his followers. And I think it's very easy for all of us right now to just sit here, hear things like that and almost laugh and not really take it too seriously, because we are not brainwashed, for starters. But to us, this sounds completely ridiculous. It's almost like, well, how does anybody believe that such a thing can exist? But Balor's followers are completely brainwashed at this point. They hang on every single word that Balor says. So they believe him. So now we're getting to the part of the story where Katy is introduced. Remember, I spoke about her in the intro, the baby that was born into the cult and held captive for 30 years, which that in itself is just completely mind-blowing. So the series of events leading up to the birth of Katy is that Balor's wife, Chanda, was pretty seriously ill. And she was so severely ill that she had to be hospitalized. And she was in hospital for quite a long time. So now Balor is living in a house with 7 other women and his wife is in hospital. And I feel like we all know where this story is going right now. Because pretty much like every single other disgusting, creepy cult leader, Balor decided that he wanted to start having sexual relations with the other women in the cult. But the thing is, the sexual relations were not consensual, let's just say. So all 7 of the women were sexually abused by Balor. Balor started by forcing all of the women to perform oral sex on him, and if any of them refused to do this, Balor literally threatened to kill them by using their pressure point on their throat. So he is literally threatening to kill these women if they don't perform sexual acts on him. And it only escalated from there, because from the oral sex, he then forced the women to perform very humiliating, degrading acts on him, which I'm not going to go into detail because honestly, I don't need to. Just think of really humiliating sexual things that someone could force you into doing, and that is what Balor was forcing the women to do. And it wasn't long until he was raping all 7 women on a daily basis. This sexual abuse happened every single day. But it didn't stop there. Oh no, of course it didn't, because Balor actually created a rota so he could sexually assault the women on a fixed schedule, which, I'm sorry, just adds another layer of absolute sickness to this whole thing, because this rota would just be on the wall, so the women that lived in this house would know exactly what day and what time they were going to be sexually abused, which, I'm sorry, if that is not another level of sick, I don't know what is. The women were given 1-hour time slots to be sexually abused. And even after his wife returned home from the hospital, the sexual abuse did not stop. I actually don't know if his wife was aware of the sexual abuse, because all the time Balor would just find reasons for his wife to leave the house, so then Balor could sexually assault all of the women in the house, which is very hypocritical, isn't it? Because not too long ago, he was preaching to all of his followers that they were not allowed to leave the house. But now all of a sudden his wife is allowed to leave. And this sexual assault went on for years. Years and years. One of the women later testified that she was sexually abused. I think she was raped every single week for 6 years. And I just find it really heartbreaking that all of these women really did believe that Balor could kill them with just a single thought. If Balor wanted to, he could set Jackie on them to kill them, which is why they almost willingly participated in the sexual abuse, which is honestly just so sick, and it's just so absolutely heartbreaking. And it was because of all of this sexual abuse that one of the women fell pregnant. And this woman was Sean, which I said was a very key character in this story. So this is when Katy was born. She was born into this crazy cult, and as you can imagine, she did not have a normal upbringing. Katy wasn't actually given the name Katy at first. That is just the name that she has chosen herself later on, which is why I'm using her chosen name. Instead, at birth, Katy was given the name Prem Malpinduzi, which translated to Love Revolution. And it was at this point that Balor introduced the rest of the group to something that he called Project Prem. Balor decided that Katy was going to be raised like no other child had been raised in the world. Instead, Katy would be raised in isolation, without love, without family, without outside influences, so she could remain pure and safe from the British state. Balor could not risk Katy, quote, becoming soft, which meant that she was to be shown no love, no affection, no close human contact, nothing. She was basically to be raised the complete opposite of how a child should be raised. This also meant that Katy was never allowed to know who her parents were. Even though Balor and Sean knew that they were obviously Katy's parents, and the rest of the collective knew that Balor and Sean were her parents, no one was allowed to tell Katy this. Instead, Katy would be raised collectively by the whole group. Everyone was just supposed to believe that Jackie had brought Katy into this world somehow. And this just doesn't even seem real, does it? Like, it doesn't. How can anybody do this to a child? And it's unbelievable what Katy had to go through, because on top of all of that, she was never allowed to be comforted. The group was strictly forbidden to show her any comfort, any love. So when Katy was a baby, and I need to stress this, newborn baby, when Katy would cry like a baby does, the group were just instructed to ignore her. And if Katy, as a baby, couldn't be controlled, Balor would resort to violence. Balor would beat Katy until she was covered in bruises. And this situation is just really hard to imagine because obviously the group kept Katy fed, they kept her warm, they kept her clean, but they didn't show her any love. They didn't hug her, they didn't comfort her, they didn't play with her, they didn't talk to her. A child needs this. A child needs a safe pair of hands. A child needs comfort, they need love, they need fun, and Katy had none of this. Katy was also never allowed to visit the doctors, and this went for the whole group, not just Katy. The whole collective were never allowed to visit the doctors, the dentists, and literally, and I mean literally, everyone in the collective, their teeth were all falling out. It didn't matter how much pain people were in, people were not allowed to go to the hospital, to the doctors, because Balor despised Western medicine. And if anyone was seriously ill or sick, Balor's solution was to tell the person who was sick to meditate and concentrate on him. They needed to devote their mind to Balor, concentrate on him, only think of him. And if they did that, they would get better. And if they weren't getting better, that meant that they weren't doing it properly. And because of this, Katy, along with quite a few others in the group, were left with serious, undiagnosed, untreated health problems. On top of all of this, it was decided that Katy would never be allowed outside the house. She would never be allowed to go to school. She would never be allowed to play, to have fun, to ride a bike. She wasn't even allowed to run. Pretty much everything a normal child wants to do and is allowed to do, Katy wasn't. And it just is crazy that she wasn't allowed to run. Like, that is just something that I can't get my mind around, because children run. Children play, children have fun, but Katy wasn't even allowed to run. Instead, Katy would be completely isolated, completely alone, with Balor as the only influence in her life. And this, as you can imagine, had absolutely devastating effects on Katy. I mean, of course it did. The only thing that she knows in this whole world is Balor and this cult. And she has literally no idea about the rest of the world, about how she should be living. This is normal to her, which is truly heartbreaking that her life so far has been so miserable, but she thinks it's normal. But the brainwashing only gets worse from here, because when Katy was old enough to walk and talk, there was obviously a risk that she might escape. So Balor brainwashed her into being absolutely terrified of trying to escape to ensure that she never would. Balor told Katy that she was a high priority target of the British state who wanted to capture her and kill her. She was told that everyone outside of that house was a member of the British state and she could trust no one. There was one time, on the rare occasions where Katy was allowed in the back garden, that a child from the house next door saw Katy in the garden and started to wave at her like a normal child. Before Katy could even respond, before she could even wave back, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if Katy didn't even really know what a wave was, which is just really sad. But before she could even react, two of the women from the cult rushed outside, grabbed Katy and dragged her back in the house. And when the women got Katy back inside, they said to her, "What were you doing? That child was a member of the British state. That child was sent by her evil grandparents to capture and kill you." And this is just one of many examples of the extreme brainwashing that Katy went through, because Katy is a child. I think she was about 3 years old when that incident happened. She is going to believe the adults around her, because children believe adults. At this point in her life, Katy has no reason to not trust the people that she's living with. And it wasn't just Balor that was brainwashing Katy. From that example, you could see that the women were also participating. And Katy went to bed every single night having nightmares about everyone outside of the house trying to kill her. And after that little incident where Katy was in the garden, from that moment on, Katy was never left alone. She was with someone 24 hours every single day. And I do mean she was never alone. Whenever she used the bathroom, someone was there with her. In the shower, someone was there with her. Even when she went to bed at night, one of the women had to lay down next to her, and she was never allowed in the garden on her own again. Katy was told that if she ever went by the windows, if she ever looked out of the windows, one of her enemies would see her and capture her. And if she ever picked up the telephone, it was always the enemy on the other end, and they would send electronic waves through the phone to kill her. She was also told if she was to ever step foot outside of the front door, she would suffer what Balor called spontaneous human combustion. And this is another thing that's completely unbelievable. Like, none of us believe this, but Balor had managed to convince all of his followers that he could spontaneously make any of them explode at any moment with just the click of his fingers. And Katy believed this. Of course she did. She's a child. She has no perception of anything else in the world other than what Balor is telling her. And can you imagine how terrified Katy would have been? I mean, she's a child and her head is being filled with all of this death of killing. Katy is literally terrified to move, to put a foot out of place, because she is constantly worried that she is going to be killed. And there was just an absolutely horrific incident when Katy was just 4 years old, where as punishment, Balor threw Katy outside of the front door and Katy went into an extreme panic. So all of this started because Katy was ill. She was throwing up. There was clearly something wrong with her. She clearly had a stomach bug or something like that, and she kept vomiting everywhere. And Balor was becoming infuriated at her because Balor was telling her, you need to meditate, you need to concentrate on me, and then you will be cured. But obviously, if she has some kind of stomach bug, some kind of infection, that is not going to work, so she wasn't getting better. So because she wasn't getting any better, Balor dragged her through the house, threw her on the floor by the front door, and literally started kicking and stomping on her head. And I feel like I just need to remind you all that she is only 4 years old at this point. And then Balor, still completely enraged, grabbed Katy and threw her out of the front door. And then he just shut the door. So Katy, 4 years old, is now outside of the front door for the very first time alone. She went into a complete panic attack. Her lungs were closing up, her head, she was getting dizzy, she didn't know what to do, she was screaming. She thought that she was going to get killed. She had always been told that if she stepped foot outside of the front door, she would be instantly killed. So at 4 years old, she is now in a full-blown panic attack because she thinks that someone from the British state, an enemy, is going to come and kill her. Even though she is incredibly weak from being sick, remember she's still ill, she has been beaten up, she finds strength to get up and start beating her fists on the front door, trying to get them to let her back in. And finally, after what must have felt like a lifetime to Katy, Balor let her back inside the house. He then said to Katy that he was willing to show her mercy and forgive her for what she has done. He made Katy believe that she was the one that needed to apologize to him, that she should be grateful for Balor letting her back in, for saving her life. Oh my God, another thing that just makes my blood boil. And this tactic that he did is just classic cult leader, isn't it? Classic cult leader 101. Life for Katy and the other women in the collective operated under a very strict schedule. And I mean literally everything that the women and Katy did was down to a very strict timetable that Balor gave them. First of all, they were all required to attend his daily lectures, where they were all made to stand during these lectures, maintain eye contact at all times. And if any of them broke eye contact, if any of them sat down, they would be beaten up by Balor. During these sessions, the collective were made to recite Balor's quote, truths, and they were forced to say the words Balor is God, God is Balor, Balor is knowledge, knowledge is Balor, and they were made to recite this over and over again every single day. And if that is not brainwashing, I don't know what is. There was also a chore rota that was scheduled, and all of the women had to take turns doing the chores around the house. Of course, Balor did nothing. All of the meals were scheduled. They had to eat at the same time every single day. The women obviously cooked the meals, and Balor always had to have the first serving of every single meal. Also, during meal times, there had to be silence. No one was allowed to talk. Even afternoon naps were scheduled every single day, and whenever Balor took a nap, everyone else took a nap. Even his showers were scheduled, and it was imperative that one of the women from the collective would turn on the shower for him. I know, he can't even turn on his own shower. And this was seen as a great honor bestowed on you if you were the one chosen to turn on his shower. And then after his shower, someone would also have to turn it off. Again, this was seen as a great honor. And then this next bit is just completely unbelievable. So the 16th of July and the 16th of October were both very, very important days, and both days were celebrated. So we know that the 16th of July was Balor's birthday. Well, the 16th of October was the day of his conception, which he also saw as a day to celebrate. And then at the start of every single day, the collective would stand together and sing songs of praise for Balor to celebrate his existence. And obviously these songs were written by Balor, and I just can't believe it. Like, the ego on this man is absolutely unbelievable. Like I said, do not think that this is the most egotistical person we have covered so far on this channel. And as you would expect in a cult like this, if anyone ever stepped out of line, violence would soon follow. Slaps and punches were a common occurrence, multiple times a day. Katy would often see the women in the cult with thick blood coming from their nose and their ears on a daily basis. And these beatings could come from anything from a minor transgression, such as breaking eye contact. The women were also beaten if they ever complimented each other. One time, one of the women said that they liked another woman's hair, and Balor beat them up. But what made everything just a million times worse is that these rules could change on a daily basis. So Katy and the women of the collective constantly lived in fear that they were breaking a rule that currently didn't exist. Everyone in that house constantly lived in fear. And when Balor would attack the people of the collective, if anyone ever intervened, ever stepped in, the beating would be 10 times harder. But what is the most tragic thing about all of this is that most of the time, the women of the collective would snitch on each other to Balor. Balor had managed to create the atmosphere where all of the women would turn on each other. They were all jealous of one another. They all hated one another because they all wanted to be Balor's favorite. So the women would think that if they snitched on other women and Katy, they would become the favorite. So not only do all of the women live in fear of Balor, but they also live in fear of each other. Except for Katy. Katy never turned anyone in for any rule breaking, but the women would always turn Katy in. Katy was not immune to any of this, even though she was a child. And Katy was forced to live under stricter rules than anyone else. She was forced to wear genderless clothing. She was forced to have her hair short. She had been completely stripped of any identity. She wasn't allowed to daydream, fantasize. She wasn't even allowed to giggle. How do you stop a child from giggling? It's like, oh my God, it's hard to imagine. And like I said earlier, she wasn't allowed to run around. She wasn't allowed to do anything normal for a child. And if any of these rules were broken, so if Katy giggled one time, she would be beaten up by Balor. And sometimes he would even use objects to beat her up, like a ruler, wooden spoons, slippers, shoes. But most of the time, it was with his own hands, and he would beat her until his own hands were bruised. And then he would turn around to Katy and say, "Look what you've done to my hands." Balor would tell Katy that it upset him deeply to beat her up, but the bruises on her skin were a sign of his love. And sadly, the woman that turned Katy in the most to Balor was Sian, Katy's own mother. Sian was the one that betrayed Katy at every turn possible. She would just stand there and watch Balor beat up her own daughter after she had turned her in. There was even a time where Sian forced Katy to eat her own vomit as a form of punishment. And understandably so, Katy had a huge hatred towards Sian. Like, out of all of the women in the collective, Katy hated Sian the most because she was the most evil. Katy had no idea whatsoever that Sian was actually her birth mother. And Katy had to suffer like this every single day from the moment she was born all the way through to her teenage years. Not only did she face violence on a daily basis, brainwashing, manipulation, she has also said that her life was mind-numbingly boring. She literally had nothing to do with her day. Every single day there was nothing to do, ever. Even talking to the other people in the household was frowned upon. Like, it's just so hard to even imagine. I know I've said that so many times already in this case. I know I'm a broken record, but it really is just hard to imagine what her life would have been like. Because there was literally no one in the house for Katy to talk to, she found herself talking to objects just around the house. Like, she would talk to the bathroom tap just for company. The group did move around a bit. They did live in quite a few houses, and most of the time they just moved around to avoid detection. But apart from that, Katy has said that every single day consisted of the same 10-step schedule. Every day was exactly the same, and I have the 10-step routine here. Number 1, lectures. Number 2, singing. Number 3, writing. 4, food. Number 5, afternoon nap. Number 6, bath time. Number 7, study. Number 8, discussions with Sean to debate if I've been a, quote, good soldier that day. Number 9, food. Number 10, more lectures. Even Katy's toilet breaks were restricted to 1 to 2 minutes. And they were all living through this, all of the women, even though the women are obviously not completely innocent themselves, they are completely brainwashed. They are all victims of Balor. And I'm sure you're probably asking, because I asked multiple times during my research, why did no one leave? Why did no one try to leave? Especially the adults who should know that something like Jackie doesn't exist. Because obviously Katy, she's a child. She's grown up in this environment. She knows nothing but this environment. But the adults, like, they should know better. And there were times where a couple of them did try and leave, but it's not always that simple. One day, one of the women in the collective, a woman named Leanne, just stood up and said, I'm leaving. And as you can imagine, this did not go down well with Balor at all. He actually ordered the other women in the collective to hold Leanne down whilst he beat her up. But after this, Leanne was not deterred. She still wanted to escape, but this time she decided that she needed to do it in secret. So one day, she actually did manage to escape the house, and she made it from London to Southampton. But as soon as she got to Southampton, she was lost. She didn't know what to do. She had spent so many years in the cult, she didn't know how to operate in the real world. So she phoned Balor and apologized to him and begged him to take her back, which he did. She then stayed in the house for another year, but thankfully in 1989, Leanne actually did escape from the house, and she never returned. And then 3 years later, in 1992, another member of the cult escaped, a woman named Cindy. She had been beaten so badly over the years that she had completely lost the hearing in one of her ears. And one day she decided that she had had enough, and like Leanne, she escaped and never returned. So 2 members had now successfully fled the cult. And this made other members of the collective question how powerful Balor really was, because he had been preaching all of these years that he could kill any one of them with a single thought. But the women were starting to think, but if these 2 other women have escaped, and they escaped and they're completely fine, how powerful is Balor? After years of manipulation and brainwashing, Sean finally started to open her eyes. This was now December of 1996. Katy was currently 14 years old, and Sean was finally seeing through Balor's BS and seeing him for what he really was. She finally started to see all of the contradictions in his teachings, in everything that he was saying. And one day she just went up to him and said, if you're immortal, if you're God, why are you aging? And you can all imagine that Balor did not take too kindly to this. Huge arguments broke out between Balor and Sean, and as you can imagine, a lot of violence took place as well. One time, Katy found Sean completely tied up. Her hands, her feet tied up, she was gagged. And apparently Balor said that he did this because Sean had tried to escape. And then things calmed down. Balor untied Sean. Everyone thought, okay, everything's over now, it's all calm. Everyone went to bed. But the very next day, Katy heard screaming coming from the back garden. And Katy rushed out to find an absolutely horrific scene. Sean's body was lying there, crumpled on the concrete floor. Sean had fallen from an upstairs bathroom window. Her neck was broken and there was thick blood oozing from her head. Balor told someone to call an ambulance, and then he said, quote, don't touch her. It might be used as evidence. Someone might say we pushed her. And I know what you're all thinking, because I'm thinking it too. Yes, I am. It's like, why would you say that? Why would you say that unless you pushed her? So Sian was rushed to hospital. Apparently Balor was all of a sudden okay with her going to the hospital. The doctors treated her and Sian was paralysed from the neck down. Sian was kept in hospital for months, and at this point Katy had started to figure out that Sian might be her birth mother. She'd actually come across her birth certificate, and on the certificate it said that Sian was her mother. Balor had told Katy though that that document was fake and to not believe it. However, Katy, she's now 14. She's not stupid, you know? She's not believing everything that Balor is saying anymore, and she is starting to figure out things. And Sian is in the hospital right now. She is literally clinging to her life, and Katy at this point doesn't think that she's ever going to see Sian again, who she's just figured out is her birth mother. But amazingly, Katy is allowed to visit Sian. And when the visit is over and it's time for Katy to leave, Katy plucks up the courage to say something to Sian, even though she knows that Balor is not going to like it and she's probably going to pay for it when she gets home. But Katy says to Sian, "Bye-bye, mommy." And at that exact moment, Katy said that she saw something in Sian's eyes. She saw love for the first time. Sian's whole composure completely changed, and in response Sian said, "Bye-bye, baby." In that moment, Katy was filled with questions. She wanted to scream, "Are you my mother?" But tragically, Katy was never able to ask that question. She was whisked out of that room before she could even get another word out, and 5 days later Sian fell into a coma, eventually passing away. And Katy would never see Sian, who was her birth mother, ever again. The police did investigate Sian's death, but because Sian was actually in the hospital for 7 months, and because so much time had passed from her initial injuries, it was impossible for the police to determine whether she jumped or whether she was pushed. So Sian's death was ruled as an accident. I definitely have my suspicions. I don't have my suspicions. I believe that he pushed her. Sian was trying to escape. Obviously, it is very plausible for someone in her situation to want an out. Any way possible, she wants to get out. Balor literally had Sian tied up the day before. Then an argument broke out, and apparently she fell out of a window. And then the first thing he says is, "Don't touch her. It could be used as evidence. Someone might say we pushed her." Who says that if you haven't pushed them? I'm sorry, I'm not buying it. I am not buying that it was an accidental death. No way. But if you thought one suspicious death was bad enough, well, it doesn't end there. And this happened just 4 years later. A woman named O fell in the kitchen. Suspicious. And when she'd fallen over, she had hit her head and she was severely injured, and she begged Balor to allow her to see a doctor. But Balor refused. Balor would not let her see a doctor, and the next day she tragically passed away. She had suffered a stroke from her injuries. It is reported that she died of natural causes, and no police investigation was ever done. So that is now 2 perfectly healthy adults suspiciously dying in the cult in a relatively short space of time, and no one was asking questions. More and more time has passed, and Katy is now in her 20s, and I feel like we just need to stop and pause for a moment and remind ourselves that she is 20 years old, but this has been her whole life since birth. And the older Katy got, the more she started to question the world around her. Now, Katy was given one luxury in life, and that was reading. She had been given a limited set of books and she devoured them. She loved reading. She read pretty much anything that she could get her hands on. It was her only form of escape ever. And then when Katy was in her 20s, Balor allowed her to read the Harry Potter series and the Lord of the Rings series. Balor had granted Katy this luxury because he strongly identified with Harry Potter and also Aragorn. It's like, really, Balor? You're choosing Harry Potter, who I suppose you could call the chosen one, and then Aragorn, the rightful king of Gondor. You couldn't be further from the two. Okay, and Katy agreed. When she read the Harry Potter series and the Lord of the Rings series, she actually thought that Balor was more like Voldemort and Sauron. And once Katy had started to question Balor in her mind, it opened up a whole new world to her. She finally realized that she doesn't want to be a part of this. She doesn't need to be a part of this, and that she wanted to get out. So at the age of 22, Katy made her first escape. And this took an absolute enormous amount of mental strength. But somehow Katy managed to flee through the back door and Balor didn't notice. And Katy, being in the outside world, was absolutely terrified. She had never known this world. She had always been told that the outside world was evil. She literally had no clue what to do, but she spotted a passerby who thankfully wanted to help her. Katy was like, please, please, please help me. And the passerby pointed her to a police station. And then when Katy got to the police station, she didn't know how to articulate herself. She didn't know how to explain her situation. But Katy also didn't want to get Balor in trouble. She just wanted to get out of there. So Katy, being at the police station, all she could say was, I've ran away from home. And unfortunately, the escape didn't exactly go to plan, because the police, after hearing Katy just say, I ran away from home, phoned Balor up to come and collect her. But it's just so heartbreaking that she finally gathered the strength, the mental strength to leave, because obviously she was so terrified of the outside world. She had left, and within an hour, she was back at the house. And unfortunately, Katy would spend another 8 years in that house before she ever tried to escape again. The failure of the first escape had really hit her hard, and she fell into a really deep depression after this. But there was actually a huge significant event that happened to Katy during these 8 years, and that is that she got a boyfriend. I know, you're probably thinking, how the hell did this happen? Because Katy is under all of these strict rules and regulations and everything. Well, after she escaped the first time, Balor started to worry a little bit that she was going to escape again. So he did loosen the reins a little bit on Katy. He gave her a little bit more freedom. And by giving her a little bit more freedom, I literally mean she wasn't monitored 24/7. She still wasn't allowed to leave the house. She still had to do all of that 10-step routine and everything every day, but she just wasn't monitored every second of every day. One of her neighbors was a man named Roddy, and he would see Katy sometimes at the window. And him living next door, he would pass secret letters to her from his window. And they started to communicate through letters, and before long, Katy was sneaking Roddy into her bedroom at night. And Katy completely fell in love with Roddy. Being with Roddy was the first time Katy had ever experienced love, companionship, and it wasn't long before Katy fell pregnant. And this was music to Katy's ears, because she finally felt like she had something to live for, that she had a purpose. But one night when Roddy was in Katy's room, Balor walked in and everything fell apart. Balor completely lost it. He threatened to kill Roddy if he ever returned to the house. And then after Roddy left, Balor beat Katy up so severely that she had a miscarriage, which is just honestly heartbreaking. It's horrible to even think of that happening. And Katy and Roddy obviously didn't really see each other after this moment, because Katy was terrified. And this part of the story is honestly so tragic, because Katy finally was happy, and Balor has taken that away from her, and he's also murdered her unborn baby. And obviously this had a massive impact on Katy, because she just felt like everything had been taken away from her. But eventually Katy did try and escape again, and this time her attempt was successful. So it's now 2013. It's crazy, isn't it, that this happened literally in modern times. So it's 2013 and Katy is now 30 years old, and her and the other members of the collective were given a new privilege, and that was watching TV. So one day Katy and another woman, Josie, were watching the news, and they saw a number appear on the screen that was a domestic abuse helpline. Katy was actually really ill at this point. She had undiagnosed diabetes and she was losing a drastic amount of weight. Katy begged Josie to remember the number and phone the helpline to get Katy help. And miraculously, Josie agreed to help her. And they made the call. And when the responders on the other end of the line heard what was going on in this house, that women were being held captive in just a random house in London, they sprung into action to save Katy and the other women. The police got Katy, Josie, and the third remaining member of the collective, which was a woman named Aisha. They got them out of the house and into protective custody. The police stormed the house and Aravindan Balakrishnan was finally arrested after getting away with abuse, torture, imprisonment for decades. And I'm not sure how many of you saw that coming, but we kind of have a happy ending to this case, even though this case was absolutely horrific. But there is somewhat of a happy ending because Katy managed to escape. And when the story of this cult finally broke in the media, people were so shocked. I mean, there was this cult operating for decades just in a house in London on a busy street.
3 women who claim they've been held as slaves in a home in London for at least 30 years have been rescued by the police.
A 69-year-old from Malaysia, a 57-year-old from Ireland, and a 30-year-old British woman were all rescued. All 3 women were highly traumatised and were taken to a place of safety where they remain. We have seen some cases where people have been held for up to 10 years, but we have never seen anything of this magnitude before. Thank you.
How could it be possible that this man was holding so many women captive in the middle of a busy neighbourhood? How can this child, who is now an adult, have just gone completely under the radar? How did they slip through the cracks?
Curtains were never opened at any time at all, front or back of house. The only time you'd see them was sometimes at the back when the little girl, she would turn around and pop the head up, pop back down again.
Is it disturbing to you, Peter, to think that there was a child being held captive next door?
I mean, as I'm talking to yourself now, it's actually bringing a lump to the throat. It's just the thought of what that child has gone through, and at the time I just didn't do anything about it. I mean, and I'm so sorry that I did. Again, I didn't know what was happening, but if I did, I definitely would have done something about it.
The case finally went to trial and Balor was charged with child cruelty, false imprisonment, 4 counts of rape and indecent assaults. At the trial, the 2 women that had managed to escape the cult, which was Leanne and Cindy, did take the stand to tell everyone just what happened in that cult. They gave harrowing accounts of how Balor would sexually assault them, he would rape them on a weekly basis. But most bravely of all, Katy also took the stand. She was forced to recount the horrific ordeal of the past 30 years of her whole life. And even though she was absolutely terrified that no one would believe her, because it is a crazy story, when you hear this, it is almost unbelievable, but the jury were completely on her side. And Aravindan Balakrishnan was found guilty and sentenced to 23 years in prison. And side note, the suspicious deaths of Sean and O were never investigated. Balor was never charged with anything to do with their deaths. Regardless of what you say, he is responsible for their deaths because O died from a stroke, and if she had received medical attention, there is a good chance that she wouldn't have died. And Sean was either pushed from a window or she had jumped herself. Again, if she wasn't in the cult, if she was allowed to leave, she wouldn't have jumped from the window. So regardless of how you look at it, he is responsible for their deaths. In the aftermath, all 3 women, Katy, Josie and Aisha, had to figure out how to rebuild their lives. For Katy, this process would be much harder because she didn't know anything about the outside world. She literally had 0 experience of living independently, of living outside of the cult. And when Katy first escaped, the people that were helping her rebuild her life said that she had the mental capacity of around 10 years old. And she was 30, but her ability to do day-to-day tasks like just cooking, cleaning, general just looking after yourself, her mental age was even lower at around 6 or 7. But she has had amazing help from dedicated charity services, and thankfully Katy has rebuilt her life. She has been able to reclaim some of the things that Balor had taken away from her. She was able to get an education. She actually went to university. She was even able to reconnect with Sean's mother, so her biological grandmother. Katy finally feels like she actually actually has a family now. Katy now lives in Leeds in the UK in a flat independently, and she often talks openly about her experience in the cult, hoping that her story will help others.
For 30 years, trapped in a house, part of a cult, brainwashed, imprisoned, told that if you do things wrong, there will be natural disasters outside. What was that like? What on earth was your childhood like?
Well, not even my relatives, not even my family knew I existed. No, not go to school, not even on the list of the people living in the house. So I used to think that I would be, if I had died, or if my father had killed me in rage, I'd just have been buried in the garden, and I'd have died without even ever having lived, without leaving a footprint on the earth.
Locked away in a small bedroom, Katy has now decided to waive her anonymity to help her reclaim her place in a world she was denied. Even crossing a road alone is a new skill.
At first I couldn't find my way around. I just get lost even walking down the road because everything is so big and just so enormous after spending all my life looking at four walls, basically. Nelson Mandela said about if you leave the prison with hatred and anger and bitterness, then you're still in prison. I felt like a caged bird with clipped wings, but now I feel that I'm learning to fly.
And I have seen a lot of footage of Katy, many interviews, and it's honestly so crazy to think what she went through. And it's absolutely incredible to see what she's been able to achieve after the cult. She is incredibly put together, she's so eloquent, and she is so strong, and she's also full of hope and happiness. She doesn't want to hold on to any anger or hatred. She just wants to move on with her life. And Katy actually also published a book on her experience in the cult. It's called The Girl in the Shadows, My Life in a Cult. And it's so brilliantly written. It's an incredible story. It was the book that I used a lot for my research on this case, and I highly recommend that you all go read that book. Go out, get that book, support Katy. It is an incredible book. So that is the story of Katy Morgan-Davies. Let's end it on her because she is incredibly strong and I wish her all the best. I hope that she is just thriving because she deserves it. And just one final note, on the 8th of April 2022, at the age of 81, Aravindan Balakrishnan died in prison. And when the news stories broke about his death, that was the first time I heard about this case. And when I started looking into this case, I was honestly just shocked. My jaw hit the ground because I was just like, how do I not know about this story? How was this cult operating in the UK in secret for 40 years? And I'm now only just finding out about it. So yeah, I literally heard about it when he died on the 8th of April, and I had to bring you this story straight away because honestly, Katy's story needed to be heard and I wanted to bring it to you guys. So yes, that is the end of today's video. If you are still here, thank you so much because that was a hell of a long video and I appreciate you all so much. I really do. So let me know your thoughts, theories and opinions, especially about the suspicious deaths. Like, I want to know, do you think he was responsible? Do you think he pushed Sean? Do you think he pushed O in the kitchen? Let me know because I do. As always, leave me your case suggestions in the comments down below. I always want to know what you want to hear next, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.